great pleasure to welcome you for our second panel discussion, which will be also the conclusion of the second series of our online lectures. So just to resume while we are about to begin. So the first series, which Edmund Stewart from Nottingham and we thought of organizing, was entitled Tyranny and Democracy in Ancient Greece. So this was, of course, an attempt to start from scratch, so to speak. And we also tried to invite political scientists who are, I would say, more often interested in history of antiquity than the Middle Ages for some reason. There is this interdisciplinary thing going on, which we think with Edmund, we think it's very important to try to combine historical knowledge of regimes or constitutions and political thought with political science. Contemporary political science, but well, the bridge seems to be much more easy to build between ancient history and political science than the medieval history of political thought. But here we are. So the first series was devoted to antiquity, and then I've applied for another grant, and we have this series. Which was devoted to early Christian thought. So we started with Augustine and Gregory of Nyssa. And we sort of went through the early Middle Ages and high and late Middle Ages, and I already know that we've received grant for the next series, which will be this autumn for the tyranny and related issues in the 16th century. So I think it would be good in a way to also think of our discussion today as a sort of a bridge towards what comes next, in early modernity or whatever we want to call it. So yeah, so for now we have two of our speakers. So Professor Carrie Netherman from Texas and Loïc Choyer from
Neuchâtel.
Neuchâtel, yeah.
Neuchâtel, yes.
So, and we are still waiting for Professor Laurent Bagioni from Paris. So what I would like to do today is to first ask you to sort of briefly summarize your talks, and then I would like to talk a bit about some broader context for the topic of tyranny in the Middle Ages, in the high and late Middle Ages especially. And those contexts would be, of course, Christianity, because this is what we have in the Middle Ages, and this is important, but also the legacy of antiquity. I think those two, but maybe we will come up with other ideas and factors. So, but for a start, I would like to ask you to just sort of talk briefly about your presentation, and maybe we can start with you, Carrie. You talked about Marsilius of Padua and his understanding of tyranny within the context of his broader political thought. Okay. No, you're muted, Gary. You're muted.
I am indeed. Thank you, or was indeed. I'll make a few sort of just broad comments. I had to actually go back to the paper and look at it to remind myself what was in there. I mean, it's only been, I know, a couple of months, but I've been so busy with everything else. When you asked me to talk about tyranny in Marsilio, I have to admit I wasn't sure there was going to be very much there. I mean, the normal attitude is that he simply has taken over the Aristotelian six constitutions distinction, tyranny, kingship, oligarchy, aristocracy, democracy, and polity. and that there wasn't really a lot to be said. And as is the case with Marsilius and is the case with so many other important thinkers, no matter how many years you spend reading them and rereading them and rereading them, there's always something, you always find something new, which is what makes, at least as far as I'm concerned, what makes this so, one of the things that makes this so fun is there are always new discoveries to be had. And what I realized was, in going back and in very carefully tracking tyranny in the Defensor Pacis, I noted a few things. One of which is that though he claims to be following Aristotle, he doesn't do, for example, the following. He doesn't have any discussion about which is of the bad constitutions, or as he calls them, disease constitutions. He's taking that over from his own background in medicine. He's not interested in which one is better, which one is worse, which of course there's a lot of discussion about in the politics. And likewise, healthy constitutions, the same thing is the case. He simply says, which one's better, which one's worse? He says, I don't want to talk about that. That's not relevant to my project. And of course, remember, his project is to beat the papacy, in particular Pope John the 22nd, as hard as possible on the grounds of their interference, or the church's interference in secular politics. I mean, that's the overall project of the Defensor Pacis. So that was one thing got me thinking is about sort of him stepping away from, as I think he does in many other cases, Aristotle. No matter how often he cites Aristotle, he's not necessarily the Aristotelian that everybody takes him to be. At least that's been my longstanding view. Just because you quote somebody doesn't mean that you agree with them or you're using them in an accurate way. The second thing I noted is there are actually very few uses of Tyrannus or of similar language in the Defensor Pacis. Defensor Pacis is a huge work. The critical edition is over 600 pages, so it's not tiny, and yet there are only a handful. I think there was I'm just looking here at my notes. There are only 16 times that tyranny language of any sort shows up. Most of those in the first discourse, which is discussion of the foundations of secular government, only a couple of times in the second discourse. And second discourse is much larger. It's literally hundreds of pages. And that is on ecclesiology, an attack on papal claims to power, to absolute power, more or less, and a defense of conciliarism, the idea that the church, that the ultimate authority in the church is the council of the church. Now, that's strange because he never engages with the idea that the Pope might be a tyrant or is a tyrant. Now, that is not an unusual position. I mean, William of Ockham, who is virtually a contemporary of Marsilio, writes a whole treatise on papal tyranny. And there are plenty of other sources that, in fact, make the same connection. So I'm thinking, now that I'm looking at these citations, I'm thinking, that's kind of strange. What's going on here? And what I concluded from all of this is that because he wants to essentially remove any kind of moral or spiritual dimension from secular government, he really can't get, okay, what in other words, what moral basis or spiritual basis are we going to use? And so he really wants to get away from Aristotelian or Christian forms of discussing justice. There's almost no discussion of justice in the Defensor, of questions of virtue and so forth, precisely because those are the kinds of things in which the church has a very strong say, and he wants to keep the church out of secular government entirely, and to give it no grounds whatsoever, that there be no grounds in which the church can claim the ability, the Pope and the church more generally, clerics, to interfere. And in fact, his argument, this is the second part of the title of the paper, his argument is that the only legitimate basis for government is volition, it's consent. And he's very explicit about that. And he ties the idea of government being basically voluntary to the way in which he on occasion uses the word tyranny. He systematically government, right? Not that it's unjust, not that it is, unvirtuous in some way. Rather, that it contradicts the basis he thinks of legitimate government, and that's volition, that's consent. And so the paper then develops that argument, demonstrates why it is that, or why I think it is in any case, that he's not much interested in tyranny. And when he does talk about tyranny, he has to remove the moral components of it. What we would think of, and what other medieval, in fact, pretty much every other medieval Aristotelian does, which is to talk about tyranny in terms of a vicious and a morally vicious or spiritually vicious or both system of government. And so, in other words, in a Christian Aristotelian vein, and he just doesn't do that. And he can't, given his project, given the overall nature of his project, he simply can't go there, I don't think. And so anyway, that was sort of the idea of the paper as it unfolded. And I mean, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to go back and look at this, because it's not something I had, and I'm in all the years I've been writing about Marsilius, which frankly goes back to when I was an undergraduate. So that's more than 45 years ago. Just simply something I hadn't really put together before. So it's been a great experience doing that. So I got that's sort of the big picture, and I'm more than happy to talk more about the elements of that. But at least I got in. You wanted ancient sources and Christianity. I got both in for you.
Yeah, we can talk more about that. Thank you. So that's a very interesting idea. There's the idea of consent or the will of the ruled as key to defining tyranny, which seems to be something quite new. Okay, so now moving to Loïc, who was talking about religious freedom and coercion on the basis of the case study of the Teutonic Knights and their crusades in the Baltic region. So we will look from the other side, so to speak. So how a religious freedom could be justified at the beginning of the 15th century. So Loïc, could you summarize your paper?
Yes, and thank you very much for the invitation to the conference and to this panel. I'm very glad to be able to be here tonight with all of you. So I prepared a short summary of my talk. The war between the Teutonic Knights, Poland, and Lithuania, which culminated at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410. We call this battle Tannenberg in West European languages and Žalgiris in Lithuanian. This war was not only fought with swords, but also with words. So just before the battle, one of the Polish ecclesiastic, a bishop, wrote a sermon to justify that the Polish soldiers were fighting a just war. And after the battle, there has been also a huge propaganda made by the Teutonic Knights and by the Polish king and his relatives, because it was very important to present a good point of view for the Polish party, because the Teutonic Knights were military monks like the Templars. So during the 13th and the 14th century, the Teutonic Knights were the spearhead of a crusade that was launched in the Baltic region to spread and officially at least to defend the Catholic faith. So it was more or less traditional for the nobility of all of Europe to support the Teutonic Knights against the Lithuanians that were pagans until the late 14th century. But the king, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, got baptized, married Queen Jadwiga of Poland, and became the king of Poland. So there was like an alliance between Lithuania and Poland. Of course, Grand Duke Jagiełło, who became the king of Poland, had to Christianize Lithuania. So Lithuania became a Christian country. But there were a small land called Samogitia in West European language, Żemaitia in Lithuania, and I think it is Żmudź in Polish. And this small part of the Baltic lands remained officially pagan until the end of the Council of Constance, so in 1417. This land was still officially pagan. This means that there has been a lot of fighting going on between the Teutonic Knights and Lithuania. What is known in Polish history as the Great War was a blow inflicted by the Polish and Lithuanian party to the Teutonic Order, which culminated in the Battle of Grunwald. And after this battle, as I said before, let's call it propaganda and counter-propaganda was very important, because the Teutonic Knights wanted to launch a new crusade against Poland, because the Poles were accused of treason, because they would have been guilty of having fought against Christians, that is the Teutonic Knights, and to have an alliance with the Lithuanians, the Samogitians, and Orthodox Ruthenians and Muslim Tatars. So it was very important for Poland to counter-attack on the field of ideas and words. So at the Council of Constance, a huge forum for international diplomacy and also religious affair in the late Middle Ages, the Polish Lauer, Paweł Wojtkowicz, offered a counterattack against the order's propaganda. His arguments were based on ideas referring to the political rights of unbelievers, and he accused the knights of tyranny and of doing what he said to be a wrong crusade. So my conference was about an exploration of his ideas, and I tried to show that Wojtkowicz's ideas were rooted in the European intellectual and political context of the late Middle Ages. And maybe just to give you an idea, I was very interested when listening to Professor Niederman, because the idea of Marsilio, who said that what is important to define tyranny is the will of a people who are ruled, and if a people agree to be ruled, then the government is legitimate, and if a people do not agree, then it is tyranny. And I thought it very interesting because Paweł Wojtkowicz says exactly this theory when he said that the Teutonic Knights had no right to establish in the Baltic lands, and even the Pope and the Emperor had no right to give the lands of the pagan Balts to the Teutonic Knights, because the pagans did not accept to be ruled by someone else. So it's very close to the idea of Marsilio de Padua. Excuse me for speaking a bit slowly, and as you probably heard, English is not my mother tongue, so I'll do my best, but I hope that you understand me. If not, do not hesitate to ask.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So I thought it's interesting that because in a way, of course, the language of the rights is the legal language, the juristic language of the time. But in a way, Carrie, you pointed out to the development of political thought in a reaction to the claims of papacy, right? So authors like Marsilio of Padua or William Ockham or others, they were attacking the idea of the plena potestas of the Pope, and their arguments were sometimes very secular. And you made a claim that in case of Marsilio, they are very secular. While it seems that from what Loïc talked about, said about Paweł Wojtkowicz's arguments, he was appealing to Christianity and the idea of to the Innocent IV. Ruling that the unbelievers have the same rights as the believers. So why don't we start to maybe to look into, I mean, this paradox that Christianity, on the one hand, I mean, the Christian church, especially in its hierarchical structure, is taken as a case study for the abuse of power and even tyranny by some authors, while on the other hand, it's an inspiration for safeguarding of what against the tyranny of secular power. So to transform those thoughts into a question. So what is the role of Christianity in all of this in high and late Middle Ages, where there is the church has a developed structure, it's somehow distinguished from the secular power in a way that it wasn't before. And so what's the contribution of the church to tyranny and freedom? How would you answer to that?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Wait, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Please, you can go first.
Okay, I get to be put on. I don't think there's a single answer to that, to be honest with you. And that I'm not. It's not a cop out, but we all know that Christian authorities, whether we're talking about canon law, whether we're talking about the fathers, whether we're talking about scripture, can be used in many different ways to justify many different kinds of conceptions of government, of power, and so forth. So, I mean, your question, and correct me if I've misunderstood, but your question implied that there was sort of one contribution, and I think it's a matter of looking at being a bit more contextual and saying, what materials are being drawn from Christian sources in order to support certain kinds of positions? And as you know, despite Gratian's attempt to make all of church law concordant and church teaching concordant, there was still a lot of debate. And so you mentioned Innocent IV, right? Now that's certainly one important source. But Innocent's position, first of all, gets read in some very different and strange ways. In other words, it's not necessarily as straightforward as it seems. And I direct people, if you're interested in that, to the work of James Muldoon, who published quite a bit in the basically 1970s, 1980s. On the topic, but it's also the case that other elements of church law, and you think of things like the work of Brian Tierney, who I disagree with about a lot of things, but who certainly who certainly makes a compelling case that there are elements of individual rights. I don't think they have a political overtone. I think that's part of the problem. He pushed that too far. But that have political rights. That have individual rights that are coming close to the modern idea, or more modern idea, of subjective natural rights. So, and that's coming out of canon law. Right? That's coming out of the canon law tradition, and it's side by side with different kinds of conceptions of rights, or rights understood purely as spiritual or religious duties. So, I'm just giving you some illustrations of why the same sources can produce some very different kinds of conclusions throughout the Middle Ages, and do. I mean, I could go on, until midnight your time, which I'm not going to do, with other kinds of examples. So I hope that's not too much of a cop out. But I mean, I really do think that saying the church's contribution, emphasis on the, is really possible. The one other thing I want to throw in, and then I'll shut up, is, of course, by the time we're getting to the later Middle Ages, you're not simply getting conflicts between secular and spiritual powers, but you're getting the conflicts in the church about where ultimate authority in the church lies. You mentioned the Council of Constance, right? But the age of councils in the early 15th century seems to me to be an awfully good example of making of setting up a problem, and perhaps intractable problem, in the question of ultimate authority within the church, and challenging from within the church the idea of the Pope's absolute absolute authority, his plenipotestus, as you say. And so there's another example of, all right, well, who's Christianity, right? Which church? I'm just sounding like Alistair McIntyre now, but that really is the case, right? That we're not talking about a monolith by any stretch of the imagination, which is a message that it would be nice to get across to early modernists and contemporary political philosophers who very often think think the opposite. Okay, I'll shut up.
Yes, I wouldn't have many things to add, because I totally agree with you, Professor. I remember a saying that was quite popular among the jurists from the Middle Ages, and it was something like this. Authorities have wax noses, but you can pull in any direction. And
exactly right.
Yes. And in fact, you can see it because, as you quoted, Innocent the Fourth, so one of the most important pope in the 13th century, which was also a scholar and a student of canon law. And you can even, I think that even today, you can quote Innocent in a conference, for example, about religious toleration. And you can also quote him, for example, to show that the Pope has the right to interfere, even by force, within a non-Christian state.
Yep.
So it was casuistic before casuistic, I would say.
Just to build on that, Innocent IV and his various decrees about this matter become a matter of conflict when you get to the 16th century, when you get to the problem of the New World.
Yes.
So you get someone like Marcusus, who's a strong defender of tolerating the native inhabitants of the Americas, using Innocent, right? And then you get the people like Sepulveda, who are opposed to, or who are supportive of treating the indigenous peoples of the Americas in a very harsh way and simply stripping them of the land, both citing Innocent IV. And sometimes the same texts, believe it or not. I mean, exactly the same texts. And that wax nose quote is just wonderful.
I asked a provocative question, of course, because I think, as I said at the beginning before we started, that only people who really deal with the Middle Ages really know about the Middle Ages, and I think it's a fascinating topic, because the popular image of the Middle Ages is so distorted in so many ways, or simplified. So, for instance, we project our view of sort of the church as some limited, fairly coherent thing, right? But it's, I mean, a question which I ask, I mean, what was the church's contribution to whatever? We could ask, what was the Greco-Roman antiquity contribution to whatever? I mean, obviously, there were different views, or as some, Martian alien would ask us, what is democracy? He would get so many different answers, and all people would claim that democracy is the best, but the understanding of this would be so different. So I think because we are treating, I would say we are forgetting that all of those people were Christians, and most of them were clergymen. So it's sometimes funny, like when a conflict between Pierre Abelard, for instance, and Bernard de Clairvaux is described as this great conflict between the church and reason. Or, I mean, both of them were clergymen, right? This was an inner conflict, and even Galileo's conflict with the church authorities. I mean, it was an inner conflict within a family, right? So I think it's important to emphasize that that we have a very narrow view, and we see the church opposed to the state as if those were two distinct entities, but it wasn't the case. So I realized partly that it was a provocative question, but this is where, I mean, a common perception would be, right? So what was the church's stance on this or that or other thing? But the diversity of opinions, the conflicts, it was all a part of the church in the Middle Ages, obviously, as you pointed out. We have a question from, or a remark from Edmund Stewart. So Edmund, you can unmute yourself and
Hello.
Speak.
Hello, everyone. Very much enjoyed your papers this semester. So thank you very much. Speaking very much as a layman on the Middle Ages, but what I wanted to ask was, it was interesting, this discussion about how the Pope, or perhaps the Teutonic Order, could be described as a tyrant. Because certainly from the ancient perspective, I would have thought that, well, it's always the case that tyranny is a constitution in a state, in a polis, in a civitas. So, and I think, and it's tyranny over. Where people are being tyrannized, it's the subjects, the citizens within that state. Now, tyranny can be used to describe, in a sense, an imperial rule or domination. So, but it's only so. Thucydides, for example, has Pericles say, "Your empire is like a tyranny." And he says this on a couple of occasions, and there are a number of other aspects. It's always, like it's that states can sort of become, you can have a polis tyrannos, but that polis tyrannos is not actually tyranny. So my question is, when we come to, I mean, I believe that is more or less, but correct me if I'm wrong, is it the case that in the Middle Ages they had pretty much the same kind of understanding of tyranny? But I think that's the case in Bartolus of Saxiferato, where he seems to be very much thinking of tyranny as a lord within a city who has maybe gone beyond his constitutional position, or is behaving in a way that he needs to be driven out. And when we come to the Pope, it seems difficult, because the Pope obviously is a temporal ruler, but what you were talking about was not the Pope's rule over the people within the Papal States. It's the rule of the whole of the Church, the whole of Christendom, his control over all of these other rulers. So I was wondering how malleable is the concept of tyranny for this application to the papacy, which, as we've seen in your talks and also a couple of others, it is applied to the papacy. So I wonder what you thought about that.
Somebody go. I mean,
Kerry.
Yeah. Okay. There's a lot in that. The first thing that struck me at the very beginning of tyranny as a constitution, I was just by, and this is complete coincidence, looking at what Aristotle says in the Politics about tyranny and kingship. I'm doing a summer independent study class with a student who fancies himself a Thomist, and I'm going to knock that out of him. Aristotle actually says that tyranny is almost not a constitution. It's almost not a politeia. I've got the politics behind me, and I can find the exact reference. But I thought that's interesting that that Aristotle is Aristotle can think in terms of the tyrant or a tyrannical system of government as being, as I said, virtually not a constitution. I don't, and that's, as I said, that's about directly what he said. The idea of the Pope being a tyrant, which, as you pointed out, Edmund, was a widespread view, at least for Marsilio, is based on the idea that what the Pope is doing is using his claim to having the keys to the kingdom of heaven as the successor to Peter, as a way of, in other words, the ability to condemn on supposedly spiritual grounds individuals or communities, to excommunicate, to interdict, and so forth, as a way of controlling or asserting control in the secular sphere. In other words, of using papal authority or spiritual authority as a justification for any kind of interference. And that's Marsilio's issue, in interference in the temporal realm. And that's Marsilio's big issue. I mean, he is looking at specifically, he is looking at what he sees has happened in Italy, especially the Regnum Italicum, what's happened in Germany. And he says, look, if you don't stop the Pope now and oppose him, and it's a call to action, it really is, then the Pope's going to do this throughout Europe, and will make himself effectively absolute ruler. But interestingly, and this is what I was saying before, Marsilio, unlike a lot of other people, doesn't say tyrant, and that's, which I think is something in need of explanation. And my paper was an attempt to at least give one kind of an account of this very strange, use or non-use of language. So, okay, that's my thoughts for the moment, and it's over to you, Luke.
So, if I understood well, Marsil does not speak about Pope John 22 as an heretic, and he does not speak about him as a tyrant, right?
Right. He does speak about him as being a heretic.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. No, he's very clear on a number of grounds that the Pope is a heretic, which again was a widely held view. You see it in William of Ockham, you see it in various other critics of John the 22nd and of early 14th century papacy. But he doesn't equate heresy with tyranny.
Yes.
But yes, and which, by the way, William of Ockham, in his little treatise, which is not so little, on tyranny, does make exactly that point, right? That a heretical pope is a tyrant, and Marsilius doesn't.
Okay, so this is very, very interesting, because a few years ago I was dealing with the accusation of heresy, or any kind of, let's say, religious deviance, or accusation of religious deviance, accusation of heresy. And one colleague was talking in a conference about the Pope as a tyrant. and the Pope is a heretic. So it was very, very this kind of topic. But if we goes back to Paweł Wojtkowicz, the interesting fact is that he seldom uses the word tyranny, and he very cautiously uses the word heresy. Then, in fact, when he accuses the Teutonic Knights of misdeeds, he accuses them of behaving very harshly toward pagans, neophytes, and even towards other Catholic Christians. So he accuses them of being hypocrites, of hiding what one may call imperialism behind religious clothes. And it's only at the end of all the trial at the Council of Constance that he explicitly mentions that the Teutonic Knights may probably be heretics. And so he wants the newly elected Pope, Martin V, to try them for heresy. And what about tyranny? In fact, I should maybe do a more another research more close to the text. But if I remember well, he uses the word tyranny very seldom, and at least in the text that I have been working, maybe the opus of Wojtkowicz that I know the best, he mentioned that the Pope and especially the Emperor acted as tyrants because you cannot because you can rule over people by three ways: by violence, and this is tyranny, or according to the will of the people, and then this is not tyranny, and this is a legitimate rule. So he quotes the word tyranny, but not directly against the Teutonic Knights, as far as I remember. But all his talk is an allusion to what one may call a tyrannic behavior by the Teutonic Knights. And I think that maybe one point is that in the Middle Ages, you had a very common rhetoric, but you mentioned that people are behaving very bad, and then you stop and you say, I cannot say that what they are actually doing, because it would be too hard for pious ears.
Yes, this is rhetoric, right?
Yes, it's rhetoric.
Yeah, it's unspeakable what they do in darkness.
Yes, it's
this
so
kind
unspeakable, but better not to go further.
Yeah, but I'm thinking now about Edmund's point, because indeed, I mean, and Edmund's in his research, you emphasize this, that in antiquity, tyranny is the way of ruling the polis by monopolizing power, and also, of course, Aristotle, not only him, but he links tyranny to any form of rule which disregards the rule of law. So there is this idea of tyranny as being lawless. Of course, Plato focuses more on the psychology of the tyrant and moral and spiritual dimension. But I think in the Middle Ages, and correct me if I'm wrong, because my impression is that the emphasis on the sort of moral, individual, and psychological aspect of tyranny, even though they didn't know Plato, is is quite significant. So, for instance, in medieval readings of politics, they focused on the distinction in Book 1 between the despotic, regal, and political forms of rule, which Aristotle describes when he talks about the household, not about polis. And Aristotle does this interesting philosophical analysis. So, for instance, that the rule of the father over the slaves is the despotic rule. The rule of the father over his children is the regal rule, and the rule of regal rule, and the rule of the husband over wife is a political rule. So Aristotle makes those distinction, and he also says that, as far as I remember, that the rule of soul over body is despotic, because if I want to raise my hand has nothing to say about this. I'm just controlling my hand, absolutely. But my rule over my passions, my emotions, is a different kind of rule, because my passions can have a say, and of course my reason should rule them, but it's not that automatic. So some medieval authors, they try to apply this to the political communities. So this is this sort of convergence of human relationships, psychological mechanisms, political ideas. I mean, it seems that in the Middle Ages, the word tyranny starts to mean any kind of violent imposition of power on anyone, on a free person. If a free person is subject to some kind of oppression, coercion, which violates their freedom, their rights, even their consent, this is always some kind of tyranny for medieval people, while in antiquity it wouldn't be necessarily the case, I think. So I wonder what you think about that.
Well, one thing I was going to throw in before, and it slipped my mind, is that in the later Middle Ages already, it's the case that you have really multiple concepts of tyranny. And whereas, there are certainly the tradition coming out of Aristotle and Isidore of Seville and Gregory the Great, for example, is essentially tyranny is always the rule of the of the individual in a completely self-interested way that does not contribute to, in fact, detracts from a common good, right? I mean, I think that's what we think of as tyranny in sort of the tradition of political thought, whether it's classical or whether it is it's medieval. But what's interesting is that you get a couple of different accounts of tyranny that say, now, hold on, wait a minute, not so fast. Tyranny can actually be, under certain circumstances, a positive thing, or at least needs to be understood as not being necessarily and wholly negative. Just to give you one example, there is an ongoing dispute that you see from really, at least from Dante on, about was Julius Caesar a tyrant? And if so, maybe he was. Was that necessarily a bad thing all the time? That, I mean, it really is fascinating, because you get the parsing out of tyranny in such a way that it actually can be something that contributes to a common good. Right? So, as strange as that sounds, given the tradition that we generally are familiar with, the ancient and Christian tradition that we're familiar with, it sounds odd, and yet there is, as said, by the time we're getting into the 14th century, there is a lot of interesting conversation going on about the legitimacy of tyranny. There's just to give a reference. There's a paper in a journal called Contributions to the History of Concepts that I published, I don't know, about maybe 5 years ago, that's called Three Concepts of Tyranny in the Latin Middle Ages, or some title close to that, in which I unpack all of this, talk about the sort of the commonplace conception of tyranny that you get from, like I said, from Gregory the Great, from Isidore of Seville, from and then from Aristotle, when Aristotle's Politics becomes available, or Ethics and Politics become available in the middle of the 13th century. But then these other concepts that are not so, wholly critical of the tyrant and of tyranny. So there's, again, going back to the theme we were talking about earlier, there's a lot more ambiguity in medieval political, legal, theological, and so forth writings than than the Middle Ages is normally given credit for. And you can do that even with the tyrants.
Isn't it linked, would you say, I mean, the positive description of tyranny, isn't it linked to nominalism? I mean, as far as I remember, William of Ockham, I'm not a specialist, but it seemed to me that he wasn't particularly interested in describing the ideal constitution, or so he was sort of whatever goes. I mean, in this circumstance, this could be okay. Of course, for some people, including me, nominalism is a sort of a, target sitting duck. I mean, because of course, a lot of blame was maybe rightly so put on nominalism, but I mean, nominalism seems to open up those possibilities of very pragmatic, sort of practical evaluation of political regimes without a reference to sort of eternal law of God and things like that.
Yeah, but I mean, well, of course, part of the problem is this big question in Occam scholarship, which is, now remember, Occam does all of his philosophy and theology up to 1328, right? He's hauled to Avignon because one of his colleagues at Oxford has charged him with heresy, and while he's there, he's exposed to the spiritual Franciscans, and then starts writing. He goes into exile with Ludwig of Bavaria, with the wannabe emperor, the king of Germany, who's in a conflict about trying to get crowned as emperor with John XXII, or by John XXII. And Occam never writes any more philosophy, theology, logic again, ever, not a word. He only writes political treatises, most of which are polemical, and up to his death in 1349, his interest in philosophy, theology, logic just disappears. Now, I'm mentioning this because one of the big questions in Occam scholarship is there a relationship between his nominalist philosophy and his political writings, and or does he just, I mean, is there a kind of a for, to use the old Althusserian term, a coupe epistemologique there? I mean, does he just, is it two different Occams in effect, and that break? So what you've hit on is the issue. It is an important issue, which is, does his nominalism matter in his his later political writings or not? I'm not going to offer an opinion on that. I mean, I've seen good arguments on both sides of it, on both sides of the question, but it's by no means a settled by no means a settled issue. Now, I don't know how much that helps you or hurts you, but I mean,
yeah, but I mean, it's tempting to try to see in sort of broader terms, which are always, with a lower resolution, you always lose nuances. But when we get to Hobbes, for instance, right? So there is this. At least you can interpret this as a disappearance of all the constraints on secular power in Hobbes, which is sort of concomitant with the disappearance of Christianity as sort of a separate source of power, which could potentially limit it also metaphysically by at least claiming that there is some law which is completely above the ruler, right? Which was I think a common view of the Middle Ages. At least the majority of authors would say it. So I think you can read backwards from Hobbes to the nominalist saying, well, if you get rid of any metaphysical ground for criticizing a particular constitution, then you get what comes later. So there is no point in distinguishing between a king and a tyrant, right? Only on the grounds of which one is more efficient, or are people more or less satisfied with what he does. Yeah, but Marsilio, in your reading at least, he would sort of come close to that, because Marsilio says, I mean, if people consent, that's fine, right? So yeah, you can have a tyrant in a very Hobbes-like fashion, but if people say, okay, be a tyrant, just give us security.
Well, it's not just security. I mean, this is, again, in my original paper, I make the point, which is a point I've made before, that consent for him is specifically based on individual self-interest. He says repeatedly that no one knowingly harms himself, and that and on those grounds, consent must be the foundations for law and for anyone, any person or group of people who authorize, who enforce the law. And so it's there's no moral content there, right? It is, I judge my own self. I judge what is what I will consent to, only with reference to my material self-interest, right? Not my spiritual self-interest, not my concern about salvation. It's very clear, which is, again, a strange, you'd think a strange doctrine for the 14th century. You move that forward, though, and in fact, it was a dissertation, became a book by Bettina Cook, in which she traces, and in some of her other writings too, she traces the relationship between Marsilius and Hobbes, which is very interesting. The book actually looks at two potential readings of Marsilius, one by Hobbes, the other by Althusius, both of whom arguably, well, Althusius definitely knows Marsilio because he quotes him. Hobbes likely did, because there had been a 16th century English translation of the Defensor that had fairly wide, it was an expurgated translation, but that was circulated fairly widely in England. So even if he didn't know the Latin, he is quite likely to have known the Marshall. William Marshall was the translator. The translation, as I said, that was done in the 1530s or 1540s. So just before Hobbes's time of flourishing. So, I mean, I think if you're looking at Marsilius, there's much more of a connection intellectually with somebody like Hobbes. Marsilius doesn't go quite as far as saying there's that talking about tyranny is just ridiculous. I mean, Hobbes's great line about tyrannophobia, is that the phrase he uses? And using external standards of justice or whatever as a basis for criticizing a ruler and calling him a tyrant and therefore illegitimate, right? It undermines the authority of the sovereign. And he definitely wants to get rid of that. Marsilius doesn't go quite that far, but you know, his real disinterest in tyranny, relatively speaking, to other medieval authors who were drawing on Aristotle, or even before. I mean, think of somebody like John of Salisbury and the Polycraticus. You know, I mean, tyranny is a huge category there. That Marsilio really is, you know, virtually sui generis in that regard. That he's, because like Hobbes, he doesn't want to get moral questions tangled into moral or religious questions tangled up in politics.
Loic, would you like to add anything, or to raise some? There are so many points, so maybe you would like to comment on any of them.
Yes. First, I will say that for me it's quite a big surprise to hear that tyranny also was seen as something positive in the Middle Ages. But I remember, maybe is it linked with the renewing of imperial, let's say, ideology by Frederick II. But of course, as you said, this positive attitude toward tyranny is more typical for the 14th century. But I wonder if there have been some connections, especially at the time of Ludwig IV, who also tried to bring back a new imperial power.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Marsilio, and this is a question I was going to ask you. You suggested that the interest in the voluntary basis of government that you were observing had echoes of the position of Marsilius that I was talking about in terms of volition. And I'm curious, given that Marsilius is after he completes the Defensor Pacis, which, by the way, was today's 26th. It was 699 years ago Saturday that the Defensor Pacis is completed. So just as a piece of trivia. But the minute he finishes the work, he immediately goes to Ludwig of Bavaria and spends the rest of his career at the court of Ludwig. And there are, I'm no manuscript scholar, but there are a lot of manuscripts of the Defensor Pacis in Eastern Europe, in Germany, and I think beyond. I think Poland, for example. So I have to go back and check that. I don't want to swear to it because, like I said, I'm not a manuscript scholar. But I recall that there are that the preponderance of the manuscripts in any case are now held in German institutions of one sort or another. And to the extent that the empire or the emperor has some kind of is again, correct me if I'm wrong, but is engaged in a lot of the politics in what we think of now as Eastern Europe, that that there might be, I mean, vague echoes, but when you said that, I thought, gee, that's really interesting. When you made that point about there being a this interest in the idea of volition as the basis for government. And Marsilio dedicates, by the way, the Defensor Pacis to Ludwig of Bavaria.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I think that there even maybe there even can be some connection, for example, to the political ideas of the Hussites,
yes,
heretics, who also, of course, radically rejected the power of the Pope, And
Right.
if I remember well, some Hussites rulers and thinkers developed the idea that the people must be ruled according to the common law. And of course, this is something that is quite common for a Swiss historian.
Yeah. And the other thing is that, again, I'm sorry, I keep appealing to my faulty memory here, but I believe that Huss or some of the people around him, some of the authors around him, in fact, were demonstrably influenced by Marcilius or read the Defensa Patres. And yeah, I'm quite the sort of one of the world's leading experts on the Hussites is why can't I think of his name? Now I can see him. But we've talked about that. He's in Australia. Thomas Fudge.
Yes.
Yeah, and Thomas and I have talked about that from time to time, about the connection between Huss and or the sort of the Hussite movement and some of the writings and Marcilius. And I think it's pretty clear that there's an interaction there. There was a historical interaction in terms of who is reading what.
Okay, that there is a question or comment from Edmund, and if anyone of you in the audience want to ask a question, you can raise your hand or unmute yourself. But now, Edmund.
Hello again. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about. So an issue that's come up a couple of times now is this issue of consent and ruling over a willing or an unwilling people in the definition of tyranny. And it's certainly that's again. I mean, I very much liked your article that you, Professor Neneman, that you alluded to on the different views of tyranny. And it seems to me that this issue of consent, so it goes back to Xenophon at least, where he talks about the difference between a kingship and tyranny is that tyranny is rule over unwilling subjects.
Right.
But it's not something that I think is in Aristotle, or doesn't really crop up very much in Aristotle. And I think one of the problems with consent is it's very much a subjective way, is a subjective criterion for defining tyranny. How do you measure consent? It's often very, especially if tyranny is a constitution to be defined by force. And also there are various forms of tyranny which, like the isomnetes, which is a form of monarchy that appears, for example, in Lesbos, that Aristotle says is effectively an elected tyranny.
Right.
So what I'd be interested to know is, again, going back to the medieval authors, Marsilius and others, is this issue of consent, is that sort of a dominant one, or is it one that just sort of crops up occasionally, especially when, again, tyranny is the tyrant is someone who gradually loses popular support and the consent of the ruled. But I wonder again whether is it the main sort of criterion that people are touching on, that this is how you work out whether someone is a tyrant or not, or is it just something that sort of a more incidental criterion, or does it differ between the two, between different views of tyranny?
Well, Marcilius goes about as far as, in fact, I would say goes as far as anyone during this period in invoking consent and volition. Some of the passages that he doesn't know Xenophon, so that's not relevant. But some of the passages from the Politics that you mentioned, in fact, he cites, but he uses them. He uses their wax noses. And I mean, so in other words, the way in which he cites them are to support his own position, and Aristotle is not, what Aristotle actually is saying is not relevant. There is one passage in Aristotle where he briefly talks about about despotism or voluntary despotism. And Marsilio pulls that out and uses it in order to explain the difference between tyranny, which is not voluntary, and voluntary government, the legitimate voluntary government. But he simply exploits Aristotle's words for his own ends. You do get other theories of consent. You especially see it in the writings, in various writings that are connected with the Italian communes in the 13th and 14th century. So someone like John of Viterbo or Brunezzo Latini, who are both 13th century authors who are writing about the management of communes and the importance of consent. You see it in various ways in the manipulation of the Roman law maxim quod omnis tangent ab omnibus approbatur. What touches all must be approved by all, and that's just everywhere in both secular and church political writings, political theorizing, but also in lots of both ecclesiastical and secular documents. I mean, what's being generated by the Roman Church and what's being generated by various rulers. So the idea of consent, or ideas, I should say, of consent, are very widespread throughout the medieval period in different kinds of literatures, and instead deployed in some very different kinds of ways. Even within William of Ockham, and again, this is a paper I have written but I haven't published yet. Even within William of Ockham, he uses that quod omnis tangent maxim in 4 different ways within the course of his writings. In other words, he doesn't even use it consistently. He simply applies an idea of consent, an idea of public approval, as is appropriate according to his various arguments, his various needs, polemical or rhetorical needs. But anyway, my point is that consent, Edmund, is a very, very widespread principle, but used in different kinds of ways for different kinds of purposes.
Thank you.
Yep. Can I ask Luke a question that I made some notes here?
Yes.
Well, I'm curious about, and this question is out of ignorance. I mean, the Templars, right? And I'm not one of those big sort of Templar conspiracy guys, but the question, it sounds like some of the same things that you were describing in terms of the Teutonic Knights and accusations that were being made, or at least questions, echoed what little I know about the suppression of the Templars, or what led up to the suppression of the Templars by Philip the Fair. And I mean, is there any echo of that at all? I mean, by the time you get to the point historically that you're discussing, are the Templars even a memory at that point, but one that could offer some useful ammunition? I mean, I don't know, but it just occurred to me as you were talking.
Yes. In fact, Paweł Wojtkiewicz says in one of his treatises that the Teutonic Knights should not be called Teutonic Knight or brother of a Teutonic order, because the Teutonic order was instituted in the Holy Land to take care for sick pilgrims. And so as these people are not behaving like they are supposed to behave, they should not be called Teutonic Knights, but they should be called Templars. Yes.
And we know what happened to the Templars, right?
he even calls them Prussian Templars.
Hmm.
And the Teutonic Knights themselves, even before the beginning of these trials, the Council of Constance, were aware of the fate of the Templars. Because the procurator of a Grand Master at the Curia wrote to the Grand Master that we should be very careful with the Pope, because let's remember the fate of the Templars. So it was not a forgotten story.
Okay, that's interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just thinking about the point that Loic made earlier, and I mean about the wax noses, because I think it's interesting that in modernity, people, I mean, thinkers often would claim originality, or while they were obviously influenced by, I mean, we can point to some, some spectacular case studies like René Descartes. I mean, who claimed he was inventing philosophy from scratch, while obviously he was influenced by earlier philosophy. Of course, he was educated, right? But the great sort of myth of modernity is that you start from scratch, from the very beginning. Tradition doesn't count. While in the Middle Ages, you have a sort of a reversal of this. So people always rely on authorities. They don't want to say, well, I invented this thought, but they use those authorities even against I mean, like Thomas Aquinas quotes Augustine all the time. So you would think he was Augustinian, right? Well, he wasn't. Or the use of Aristotle politics, that there were mistranslations, of course, but they were commenting on the time, all the time, saying we are just explaining what those other people wanted to say. But you can see that they are developing their own thoughts under the cover of commentaries, the reverence. Maybe it was honest. I don't know, but it's a curious.
It's a different way. But it's a different way of arguing than the modern way of arguing. I mean, there is a, once you hit the Renaissance and the idea of what we think of as modern historical scholarship, attitudes do tend to change about sources. And of course, the best example of that is, okay, what if you want to make a point and you don't have a source? You make up the source, right? Whether you're talking about the donation of Constantine, right, total fraud, or whether you're talking about in the mid-12th century, John of Salisbury wants to make a point, I mean, an extensive point about the nature of the community as a body politic, as an organism, and he wants to do so in a purely naturalistic way. Well, he doesn't have Aristotle. He doesn't have much in the way of the classical tradition. He only has the smallest bit of Cicero. So what does he do? He creates a false document. He creates something called a letter of instruction to the Emperor Trajan by Plutarch, which we now know was a fraud in Latin. He writes 200 pages of the Polycraticus, books 5 and 6 of the Polycraticus, supposedly based on this letter that he himself has created, because he needs an authority, right? He needs an authority, and he puts 2 and 2 together, and voila, there it is. And this isn't unusual, right? I mean, this is it's especially egregious, but it's not an unusual way of constructing constructing an argument, right? Whether it's, you completely mangle Aristotle like Marsilio does, or you create, a source, as necessary. And as I said, the donation of Constantine, obviously, and also this letter of instruction to Trajan are just two especially outstanding examples.
And so on that note, we will have to wrap up. So thank you once again for talking today. It was a fascinating discussion, I think, and yeah. So let's have a good day. Have a good night.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I learned a lot. So
me too. So thank you once more, and I thank the audience also for being here, and so goodbye.
Thank you.
All right, goodbye.
Thank you very much for invitation. It was a great pleasure. I'm happy to have been able to come to the meeting. So
goodbye.
Thank you very much, and have a good evening. And don't hesitate to write me if you have any suggestion or remark or questions.
Okay.